Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very delighted to have Professor Thane Gustafson here to discuss his new book, Klimat, Russia in the Age of Climate Change. Professor Gustafson likely does not need any introduction to this audience since he's a longtime professor of government and a faculty member in CERES at Georgetown, but I do want to mention that he is the author of, by my count, 7 books dealing with Russia and Russian studies and Russian affairs. He has emerged as an analyst and prominent scholar of energy and climate change, both in Russia and worldwide. And he also has accompanied the publication of Klimat in sort of a 1-2 punch. He published 2 books in 2 years. And the other book that was published in 2020, which in many ways is a companion piece to this, is called The Bridge, Natural Gas in a Redivided Europe, which came out also with Harvard and was recently awarded the Marshall Schulman Prize from the Harriman Institute. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to let Professor Gustafson make his presentation. We're leaving plenty of time for question and answers, which I look forward very much. Okay, Thane.
Michael, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak on the subject of my latest book, Klimat. But thanks also for mentioning The Bridge, because they really form a before and after story, you might say, centering very much on current events, and we'll probably get to those in question and answer. What you see here is a picture of the cover of the book, Klimat being, of course, climate in Russian. And the book itself is very much a thought experiment. The idea is to ask, what if? What if the narrative of energy transition is real and moves forward? What if oil peaks, oil demand peaks, and then begins to decline? What if the era of hydrocarbons begins to fade, perhaps in the early to mid 2030s, and then conceivably coinciding with the end of the Putin period. Once Putin steps down, retires, he is now 69. That would make him in his early 80s. All of these things may come together. What then? That is the thought experiment that I've tried to do in Klimat. So what you see there is the first slide. And let me just take you quickly through the main argument of the book. And so, Jessica, if you don't mind, then moving up, that's right. Key points, here's a quick overview. And the idea is very much to try to get beyond the present price and gas and power spike in Europe, the present COVID, on the assumption that within another year or two, the effects of COVID will fade away, to get beyond the present tense atmosphere over Ukraine and the rest of it, and to take a long look ahead. Now, the proposition is that even though suddenly climate change is seemingly so last year, in the face of other events that have come along, why climate change is going to reassert itself, no question about that. And so there are 2 faces of climate change for Russia. One is internal. And so we hear about the Arctic, melting permafrost. At the same time, Russians will tell us that there are also advantages here, perhaps longer growing seasons for agriculture, and above all, in the Arctic Ocean, the melting of Arctic ice and the opening up of the northern sea route. At the same time, my proposition in the book is that for much of this period, it's the external effects that are going to affect Russia primarily, and in particular, the question of exports from Russia's dominant revenue earner, namely hydrocarbons, oil and gas. By the way, in round numbers, in 2019, we're talking about export revenues for hydrocarbons on the order of $230, $240 billion. And then just to keep the picture in your mind, think of a pie chart. 4/5 of the pie chart are oil revenues, 1/5 is gas revenues. So if there is a peak in oil demand after 2030, if Russian gas runs into problems in its prime European market, if there is a shortfall in demand from China, and of course, a lot of competition from other suppliers, if there is, in fact, finally at long last, a death of coal, what will all that do to Russia's prime export earners? Well, the proposition of the book is that Russia has no adequate alternatives, and half the book is devoted to precisely that, those alternatives. So I look in separate chapters at renewables, at coal to be sure, at nuclear power, at agriculture, at metals, and so you'll see brief discussions of the outlook for those. The prediction would be then, if that scenario is realized, that the main impact would be on revenues to the Russian state. And since Russia could be said to be effectively a vast recycling machine for commodity export revenues into the welfare system that the government runs, everything depends then on whether the Russian government can maintain surplus, or will it go into deficit? Will we see an era of chronic budget deficits and a threat to the future, the internal future of Russia's economic system, as well as its influence overseas? So those are the big questions in this thought experiment, which runs from, say, the 2020s today to mid-century. So the end point of the book is mid-century. So Jessica, if you'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the table of contents as I've described it. And note that there is also a treatment of the two Arctics, and we'll come back to just what that means. And note also Russian nuclear power. Just to anticipate the headline, the Russians are now in a position to supply to the world nuclear power plants on schedule, under budget, which the United States is currently certainly unable to do, which France and Britain are unable to do. But watch out, China is coming, and that is going to be a big competitor ahead for Russian nuclear. So Jessica, next slide, please. Now, this sums up not a modeling experiment. This is basically me with a pencil and a piece of paper and doing a plausibility run compared to Russia's exports in 2019 to what they might look like under the assumptions of this book by 2050. By the way, for those of you who have bought the book, and thank you very much, or who might buy the book in the future, why, I just want to call your attention that to the fact that there was a glitch in copy editing, and consequently this table, which is an all-important table, summing up the argument of the book. Unfortunately, there was a glitch in copy editing and the numbers got messed up. So these are the corrected numbers, and consequently refer to those, and those are available, as you see here, on the website of CERES. The main thing to look at here is agriculture. Russia has become once again the world's largest exporter of wheat. That in itself is a remarkable story. And you'll see in that chapter how this happened. Putin is a fan, and he believes that by 2030, Russian agricultural exports will close to double, $45 billion a year. Weapons, remarkably, despite all the attention to Russia as the world's, I believe, second largest exporter of weapons, they are not, in fact, so far as we know, one of the top export revenue earners. The profile of Russia, as we know, is overwhelmingly that of a commodity exporter. So the role of technology is very small, remains small, is likely to remain small. And so if you add up all these numbers, what you get is a dramatic decline in Russia's export revenues, and in particular from hydrocarbons. So that's the proposition of the book. Jessica, next slide, please. So despite, of course, the current focus on the increase in gas consumption and oil consumption, which is possible under some narratives, under some scenarios, if we assume that climate becomes the major driver, why then it will unfold in two stages. So for the 2020s, the Russian hydrocarbon revenues are probably safe, and indeed, they will probably increase. Take, for example, the situation of Germany. Germany has gone very far and very fast in the energy transition, the so-called Energiewende. They are shutting down their last 6 nuclear power plants at the end of this year. They have vowed to end coal-fired power production by 2030. They have launched very fast into renewables, but they don't have the power transmission capacity to take the renewable power to where the points of demand. In other words, Germany is more dependent than ever before on natural gas and will remain so. It's a safe bet throughout the 2020s. So if you're dependent on gas in Europe, that means imported gas, and that means Russian gas. And so that's a safe prediction for the 2020s. But the question for the book then is what happens after the 2030s. We will start to see throughout the world 3 major drivers: the continuing renewables revolution, the continuing electric vehicle revolution cutting into oil demand, and then inside Russia, we're going to see another trend. The traditional center of the Russian oil industry, the Khanty-Mansiysk Okrug, is under production, has been in production ever since the 1960s. It is now in decline in its conventional fields, and the next generation of Russian oil is bound to be more costly, whether it takes the form of tight oil, of which there is presently little sign in Russia, or deep Arctic offshore, in which the Russians have no technological underpinning, or simply what you might call progress along the Arctic coast. And that oil is very likely to be more expensive. So the result is not that Russia will stop exporting oil, but rather that it'll move up the cost curve, as they say in the oil business, and will become less profitable. It's the margins that will be hit, in addition to perhaps the volumes. Saudi Arabia will remain the last man standing in that scenario, and Russia will be competing against a group of increasingly desperate state-owned oil companies that need to balance their budgets. And Russia is going to find itself an increasingly high-cost producer in that competitive world. So under those assumptions, then, the outlook is from the 2030s on a downward trend in Russian hydrocarbon export revenues. So Jessica, the next slide, please. Now, the politics are fascinating because up until recently, even just a few years ago, Vladimir Putin himself took the position, a mocking position, that climate change, if it happened, would actually be an advantage for Russia. At one point, he said, I might not have to wear a fur coat anymore. Or then he started talking about the advantages of longer growing seasons and improved agriculture. And above all, the Северный морской путь, the SMR, that is the Northern Sea Route, which Putin is very definitely banking on as part of his pivot to Asia and as part of his shift from pipeline gas to LNG, and the LNG will be moving to Asia. Now, the shift has been remarkable just in the last couple of years. The climate change story, the oil peak narrative, has definitely come to official Moscow. And official Moscow has basically accepted that the narrative is plausible, that it's realistic. Even Putin has begun to talk about the dangers of climate change, increasingly focused on the permafrost problem in the Arctic. And so Putin, too, is changing his vocabulary. As people who are holding out for the traditional vision, why, as you can imagine, the energy industry is not yet fully on board, although Lukoil is, for example. That's an interesting outlier. Gazprom Neft, the oil subsidiary of Gazprom, is on board with the narrative. And at the same time, the arch conservatives are the coal industrials. SUEC in particular does not buy the narrative, and the coal industry as a whole, which is oriented toward exports now, is also deeply skeptical. Igor Sechin's story is straightforward. He says, the world is going to continue to need oil, and consequently, those of you who out there, Exxon, BP, Shell, and the others, those of you who are going green and cutting your investments, you're fools. The demand is going to be high, investment is going to be essential, prices will go higher and higher, and we at Rosneft are going to be ready when the time comes. Now, what is it that has caused official Moscow suddenly to begin to wake up and take notice? It is the prospect that Europe, as it adopts green policies, will go for what they call CBAM, that is to say, payments that will be required to offset the higher carbon content of imports into the European Union. In the first instance, steel and cement. Gas is not yet under attack, but the Russians can visualize that down the road, this is going to be one of the next targets. So official Moscow is aware, they're on the case, but there's still no consensus over what to do. If you're tracking this, there's one person you might follow, and that is a very curious figure, Ruslan Edelgeriev. Edelgeriev comes from Chechnya, of all places. He was previously the prime minister and the minister of agriculture. He has no background in climate science. And yet for the last couple of years, he has been Putin's advisor on climate change issues and the official face of Russia in international climate negotiations. Well, Edelgeriev is a fast learner, and he's actually a pretty impressive character when you see him in action. He has gradually, or in fact rather suddenly, over the last year or so, become a convert to the energy transition story. And indeed, he has been pushing, but very tentatively, something that is quite unpopular with Russian industrialists, and that is the idea of a carbon tax. So that's kind of a litmus test. Watch Edelgeriev then and see what he has to say about things like carbon taxes, carbon markets, and the like. Kind of a, how would you say, as I said, a litmus test of the middle ground in Russian climate policy. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So next slide, please. So we've just finished in November the so-called COP26 in Glasgow. That is to say, the world jamboree of many, many nations and thousands of interested parties in Glasgow to talk about climate change and what to do about it. And the Russians were there with a very large delegation. They had, I believe, if not the largest, the second largest delegation of anybody in Glasgow, representing a wide range of Russian official agencies, banks in particular, interestingly, and the Ministry of Energy, of course, the Ministry of Economics. In other words, a wide range of people who are themselves reflecting on what climate change implies for Russia. What did they have to propose at Glasgow? Why, as you can imagine, not much. With the lack of consensus inside Moscow, the lack of settled policy, no pressure from public opinion so far. So the main thing that the Russians have to offer really is their forests and the absorptive capacity of Russia's vast forests, which Russia believes are undercounted in the equation, and that consequently Russia's net CO2 emissions are a lot lower than Russia is given credit for. So far, that is the major thing that the Russians have put on the table. And so, although no one's performance has been brilliant, the Russians at this moment haven't even gotten off the starting block. Next slide, please. So what can you expect then as Russia's internal debate evolves? The man to look at who has emerged recently as the person who's in charge of domestic climate policy is Andrei Belousov, who's the first deputy prime minister, an economist by background, but someone who's actually been looking at climate issues for some time. But he's in charge not of climate solely, but of the economy across the board. And his take on the climate issue and Russia's response to it is, number one, let's take our time. There is no rush. There's no reason to go off and start issuing green pledges all over the place, although Russia has made one. But at the same time, we can take our time and develop our policy and decide what to do. Now, here he's echoing Putin's latest phrase. I think Putin used the three words "ровно, гладко и спокойно" to describe his recommendation for Russian climate policy. The main thing to do is to incentivize Russian industry. So if we get investment and therefore you need growth, why, Russian industry then will invest in the next generation of technology. What would that mean though? Russia's comparative advantage, as Putin himself underlines, is hydrocarbons. If they don't export them, they'll use them at home. Remember that Russia's natural gas, 70% of Russia's natural gas is consumed inside Russia. Only 30% is exported. Russia is, for all practical purposes, a gas-fired economy, particularly where the power sector is concerned. That is likely to remain true indefinitely, no matter what the climate change issue does in the rest of the world. Russia will remain a gas-fired power sector, except of course for the eastern third, which relies on hydropower and coal. But even there, Gazprom is penetrating the last little village with its policy of gasificatia, so gas in fact is still extending its reach in the domestic economy. Likewise, oil. If Russia doesn't export its oil, it will be available at the pump in domestic Russia. And consequently, what is the future of electric vehicles in Russia? Well, so far, none. And the outlook is probably none as well. So what is the best bet for Russian climate policy? Well, Russia is putting forward two interesting and fashionable new ideas. One is nuclear, which is newly fashionable, amazingly, everywhere except in Germany and in the United States. But nuclear is getting a fresh look all over the world, logically enough, since it doesn't emit carbon dioxide. And then finally, the great hope, hydrogen. And hydrogen is something that the Europeans are betting on heavily, that the Americans are betting on heavily. The Europeans expect that they would be able to generate hydrogen and import hydrogen. And all of a sudden, Russia says, aha. And Gazprom says, aha. Because one of the things you can do with hydrogen is mix it with natural gas, put it in a pipeline. Oh, says Gazprom, pipelines is what we do. And then take advantage of the existing gas pipeline system to continue Russia's gas business in Europe. If Europe goes green, that might be the end of Russia's gas business in Europe, but for the possibility of hydrogen coming to the rescue. So watch this space. And all of a sudden, hydrogen is all over Moscow, except that at this point, it's all talk. So as you continue watching, as you watch the Russian scene, look at Edelgiriev, look at Belarusov, look at Gazprom, keep watching what Putin has to say, and keep an eye on hydrogen. So that's it. That's a fast gallop through Klimat. But I still hope you'll buy the book.
Thank you. Yes, Jessica, if we can, we should put in the Harvard University Press link so people can actually purchase the book. And let me say that it's a really fun read. And that's actually going to be my first question, because you make it look really easy and in its readability. But while I'm asking this question, I also want to encourage the audience. We've left a big chunk of time here for question and answers. You'll see that Q&A, right now there are no questions in there. And I'd like to see some by the time I ask my 2 questions, because we really want to hear from the audience. But the first one is about how I'm fascinated by how you project the future, because I write about the past and at most the present. And you make it look easy, but I think there's a lot more that goes in there to projecting, because one does get a kind of a sense of the contours of various possible futures and all the various pieces. But in terms of actual forecasting, and you showed your table 1, but 2030 is one thing, right? Because one can sort of see the decade that we're in really pretty much more clearly. But then 2050, why that date? How do you project over decades when we really have little, we don't really know what's going to happen with hydrogen, although you might have a sense. And I did also follow your footnotes where in certain realms like agriculture or, climate change in terms of temperatures and effects, you cite other literature that's making those projections. So I just thought you might tell us a little bit about what all the things that went into your approach to those projections.
That's a great question, Michael. And the answer is I'm poaching on your territory, because I use a method that is widespread in government agencies and in corporations called scenarios, scenario writing. Now, everybody uses the word scenarios, but in actual fact, if you do it right, there is a discipline to scenario writing. You have to begin by isolating what you believe are going to be the major drivers going forward. You have to think hard about the governing constraints, things that are impossible, or constraints that can be relaxed only at high cost. And once you've done that, you then group your possible outcomes into a series of what you might call playing fields. And a friend of mine and colleague, Daniel Jurgen, and I wrote a book together 30 years ago called Russia 2010. And as one of the scenarios, we had a Russia that looks both forward and backward, which we called two-headed eagle. That's one of the scenarios that we imagined in that book. We had another scenario called Chuda, miracle, which was a vision of a market-based Russia. We got a lot of pushback from the Russian readers on that. By the way, that book was published under the Russian title 20 лет спустя, 20 years later, which is, of course, the title of a much beloved book among Russian readers, Alexandre Dumas' 20 ans après, the sequel to the Three Musketeers. So it was a title that was instantly familiar. Well, as Russians read 20 лет спустя, they said, this Chuda business, that's impossible. That's never going to happen here in Russia. And yet, lo and behold, we have elements of Chuda, and we also have elements of the two-headed eagle. But I said I was poaching from your territory, Michael, because scenario writing, what is it? It's very simply history turned around, and instead of looking backward, you turn around and you run it forward. After all, 2050 is going to arrive, at least we hope. And you'll be standing there in 2050 and you'll know how it all came out. Well, wouldn't it be great if you could have pegged it 30 years early? Well, so that's the basic idea behind a scenarios exercise, peering around the corners of history.
Thank you. Yeah, I first became interested as a child looking back by reading Isaac Asimov. And, psychohistory was the study of how to predict the future. So that actually is a great answer.
One of my heroes too, you're right.
But my second question is about one of the things I really learned from this book was some of the success stories that don't get promulgated in the press and even in the literature. And that you mentioned nuclear, and Kirienko's role in reviving that is really quite remarkable. But also the agricultural changes of especially the last decade, right? The turnaround from those of us who remember Soviet agriculture and late Soviet, it's a really remarkable story. But also the kind of younger generation of managers that has been promoted is a kind of interesting theme that runs throughout the book, and you mentioned a couple. And so I just wonder if you could talk more about a little bit about those successes and also why they're not enough, in your view, to kind of alter the overall rather dire warning that you are projecting for Russia.
Michael, I'm going to take off from your last question because, as you know, of course, better than anyone, professional historians tend to be divided in their approaches to historiography between people who emphasize structure and people who emphasize the key role of the individual and the hero in history. So you have the Annales school in France, the structuralist, and also all that. Fernand Braudel is one of my heroes, the author of A History of the Mediterranean, the classic structuralist approach. At the same time, you have what the Brits call contemptuously maps and chaps history, where everything depends on the accident, the arrow that killed King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, turned the course of history, and so forth. So at the extreme, you have two very different ways of writing history. Well, so also, as you look toward the future, we should give the Putin era, perhaps to some extent Putin himself is under-recognized, more credit than we tend to do. Putin himself, for example, as we know, he has definitely protected the hydrocarbon industry, and we know the stories of the family that surrounds him and so on. At the same time, we also know that he has been a promoter of Alexei Kudrin, who was his finance minister for 10 years. And under Putin, the Russians have put in place a very solid structure for financial, monetary, debt management, et cetera, as a result of which Russia is in a very strong position today with a modern tax system and a very conservative but successful monetary policy, $630 billion in what we used to call hard currency assets. So that's the structuralist part that has actually been quite successful under Putin and doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves. Also under the hero in history, however, there's some wonderful stories. You mentioned Kirienko, the luckless prime minister who stood there in his mid-30s in 1998 and announced to the world that Russia was defaulting on its debt. You would have thought that was the end of him. And indeed, at first it was. He went back down to Nizhny Novgorod, where he came from. But then Putin brought him back and put him in charge of what became Rosatom. And that's been a tremendous success story. So he's now the #2 in the presidential administration and a major force along with the current prime minister. All of these people, by the way, are financisti. Even Kirienko originally came out of a bank in Nizhny Novgorod. So you have that whole financist wing that is structurally very strong, but has its heroes. My own personal hero is Anatoly Chubais, known as the father of privatization. And of course, people know all of the somewhat off-color stories of how the Russian oil industry was privatized and the oligarchs were made, and they laid that at Chubais's door. But then he went on and reformed the power sector, the electricity sector, and did a pretty good job. And now he's the father, or the would-be father, of Russian renewables. And you will read that story in the book as well, the story of the Chubais reborn as the prophet of green renewable solar power. It's quite a story. Unfortunately, he's just been fired as the head of the Russian innovation company, and he's now pretty much without a job, except as an informal advisor for Russia's climate policy. So there are many, many good stories of what might be the hero in history.
That's right. And if we have time, I'm going to return to why these heroes seem constrained, and also, you know, some of it is the usual state being the center of change that comes across clearly. But, you know, I'll read a couple of quotations that really get it. Some of us Russia watchers just, it's the Sphinx's riddle, right, that we all try to address, is why things are radically transformed and do change, but then certain things remain the same. But we have accumulated so many questions now in the chat that I want to turn to the audience and at least to address some of the questions. And we have a couple that have to do with regions in far north, and I'm going to put two together right now because they're related. Joe Saylor, who is one of our series graduate students, asks, will Russia have the necessary economic and demographic resources to develop the far north and the North Sea route in the decades ahead? And then we have another related question from Bradley Gorski, who's a colleague in the Slavic department, and he writes, what a fabulous presentation, thank you. I'm curious about how you see these projected changes affecting interregional relations within Russia, since right now a lot of the status of places like Tatarstan and Permsky Krai, for instance, are tied up with their hydrocarbon production. Is that something you get into in the book? And is that a source of concern for state stability in Russia going forward?
Okay, well, on both questions, in a sense, they both come back to the Arctic, which is, of course, only natural because 70% of the Russian territory is, in fact, Arctic, even though it's not officially north of the Arctic Circle. So definitely an Arctic country. The answer to Joe's question, I think, is yes and no, which is not just an academic dodge. It reflects the fact that in the book, I argue that there are two Arctics. There is, first of all, the Arctic of the coast, of the Arctic coast, which is being developed for oil and gas. And so a lot of capital is going there, a lot of infrastructure investment is going there. The Russian gas industry has developed a whole new province on the Yamal Peninsula, which is north of the West Siberian mainland, juts out into the Arctic Ocean. And that is also the site for a remarkable company called Novatek. Here we're back to the hero in history. Leonid Mikhelson is the creator of a company that is Russia's private sector, believe it or not, champion for LNG. Now, of course, Russia being Russia, with the strong backing of the state, Putin is a fan. Putin has declared that LNG is the future of Russian gas, and gas is the future of hydrogen, and so forth, the greenest fuel in the world. But Mikhelson has built an industry and a powerful company that is, even now, is shipping LNG tankers to Asia. So that's the Arctic coast. And Rosneft is betting on the Arctic coast as well. So that is a major growth area. Then you have the rest of the Arctic, the inland Arctic, you might say. And that is the part that is increasingly vulnerable to melting permafrost. And what permafrost does is that it cracks your roads, it cracks your buildings, it breaks your bridges, and so on. And the result is that you have to spend a lot more money strengthening pipelines, strengthening buildings, your investment, it becomes even more of a high cost area than it was ever before. So that's the outlook for the inland Arctic. People are responding to that by migrating out of East Siberia, although not as much as they did in the 1990s. But even more significant, they're migrating from the rural areas of the inland Arctic into the cities. And so you have Yakutsk growing as a regional center, while the rest of the Arctic depopulates. One point in passing, the New York Times Magazine, with all due respect to New York Times, which has been doing a fabulous job, the New York Times Magazine published an article that suggested that that East Siberia would become the new agricultural breadbasket of the world, thanks to global warming. Well, they're not so fast. There are a couple of problems with that. One is that permafrost is not actually soil. It's made up of sand and ice, and then a little bit of organic matter. But once the ice and you're left with the sand, and it's not fertile soil and will not be for, well, several centuries. Then you have the problem of labor. With population leaving the rural areas, who's going to do the farming? The Chinese are not particularly interested in migrating into East Siberia. So labor is going to be in short supply. So I don't see the breadbasket coming about anytime soon in the Arctic. So Joe, I don't know if that covers your question, but that's a great question.
All right, and we have another question here from our own Jennifer Long, who from CERES, who writes, "Thank you for this interesting and important presentation. How does this is about the anti-heroes. How does corruption affect Russia's ability, the Russian state's ability to fund and address these issues you noted?"
Well, the person I recommend on that is Professor Oslund, who has written a marvelous book that stresses the damage that corruption does. Russia, among other things, is a net donor of capital to the outside world. So net investment has been, you might say, outward rather than inward, as Russia's wealthy pocket their gains and take them out of the country. Corruption, as we know, tends to debilitate the rule of law, debilitates the sanctity of contract. Some people say that, well, corruption can lubricate things, but that simply means it's greasy, and it's not going to help the cause of developing a thriving economy for tomorrow. Just next door to corruption is extortion. And we see a phenomenon of brain drain, which is a response to the fact that there is a very serious problem that affects Russian entrepreneurs, creative startups. The minute you gain attention, someone comes knocking on your door, and a lot of entrepreneurs have found themselves behind bars under pressure to sell out. And the response to that has been, I'm getting out of here. There was an extraordinary YouTube that everyone should watch by one of Russia's leading commentators, Yuri Dudj, who went to Silicon Valley and interviewed a whole range of Russians who have now set up shop in Silicon Valley, including the co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin. And these are people who say, look, as soon as you create a business in Russia, you draw unwelcome attention. That's corruption for you, and that's the price that Russia is paying right now.
I was going to pair that question with the next one, which gets also direct continuation of this, but also gets at the role of the state that you address throughout the book. It's from Professor Kelly Smith. It seems that when the Russian government takes a problem seriously, that it usually tries to solve it with its own actions or state corporations. Do you think there's really a space for Russian business and investors to have an impact? So anything to add on that?
Very good point. The revival of the nuclear power sector, I think, is a good illustration, because it was done, you might say, Soviet style, under Kirienko, who regathered into his hands the assets of the Soviet nuclear system, which had started to wander off into the hands of various oligarchs. By one means and another, he was able to bring them back together and create a company. Now, his strategy centered on the fact that the Russians had continued to build nuclear power plants outside Russia. So there was export revenue to be made from that, and that also kept the Russian skill set intact and functioning, even though at that time there was no demand particularly for nuclear power inside Russia. So the story of Rosatom has been rebuilding a centralized structure, but focused on the development of markets outside. So it's been a state-run solution. Insofar as renewables are concerned, for example, we see a number of major entrepreneurs. Rosatom is now getting involved in wind power and so on. Again, it's been well-placed, either state-owned companies or state-sponsored entrepreneurs. The only place where you've seen really an explosion of business in which the state has played only a minor part has been the transformation of the coal sector, which used to be, of course, in Soviet times, a state monopoly focused on the domestic market. That exploded, and a number of mini oligarchs, put them that way, managed to take those pieces, turn them around, and turn them toward export. And then gradually larger structures have been built, but the government has not played the same central role in that as it has, say, in nuclear power. So that's an interesting one to watch.
And also agriculture, you show that in the recent trend is really non-governmental activity, and that's one of the big successes. So that's interesting. But of course, Kirienko was forced into his strategy almost by no other way out. So it's an interesting twist as well. It's good that we're on nuclear issues, because we have a student in CERES in his second year who's writing his capstone about nuclear power in Russia and China, Yang Pan, and his is the next question. He writes that the Czech Republic recently excluded Russia and China from bidding in its future nuclear energy projects, and other European countries are also assessing the national security implications of cooperating with Russia and China in nuclear. How will geopolitics impact Russia and Chinese ability to export nuclear? Might they cooperate rather than compete in third countries?
Well, there are two parts to that question. One is, if you want to build nuclear, where do you go? And the Finns in particular have, of course, long experience in dealing with the Russians. We used to speak of Finland, the Finlandization of Finland, but in actual fact, it was the Soviet Union that got Finlandized. The Finns are no mean businessmen, and they have actually chosen Russian technology, putting aside their concerns about national security. Where do you go if you want a nuke? The Chinese are coming on strong. But they themselves, after looking at the Russian VVER technology, decided not to go forward. They are developing their own variants, thank you, and not based on the Russian technology. I think they're drawing on a descendant of the Westinghouse technology plus some input from the French. So the Chinese are going their own way, and they're doing it, of course, in that how would you say, that overwhelming Chinese way. And that, of course, is ultimately the most formidable competitor for the Russians on the horizon. The United States at this moment are nowhere. We are not currently capable of building a civilian nuclear power plant on time or on budget, or in fact, for anything less than 3 times the original budget. But what we are doing is exploring the next generation of small modular reactors, so-called. That might be the future. And the Russians on that dimension are still holding out with holding on to the large VVER standby. And the big question is whether they will be able to take the turn to the coming era of small and hopefully safer nuclear power plants.
Well, that leads us to our next capstone-related CERES graduate student question from Jessica Mayerzon, who writes that you mentioned that Russia has no adequate alternatives to export revenues from oil, pipeline gas, and coal, and that LNG is insufficient. I'm currently looking at Russia's LNG projects in the Arctic for my capstone, and I was wondering if you could expand on the LNG potential in the Russian Arctic, considering that the export revenue will likely increase in the coming years. And for example, Novatek recently signed long-term contracts for the supply of LNG from Arctic LNG 2 with 2 Chinese companies, which has also confirmed China's status as the world's biggest LNG buyer and its deepening energy ties with Moscow.
LNG is a fabulous choice for a capstone. It's a fascinating story. Individual entrepreneurship to begin with. I mentioned Leonid Mikhailson. His father was a pipeline guy. He grew up as a pipeline guy. He went to West Siberia originally to build pipelines, and then the Soviet Union fell apart. He realized that there were gas licenses to be picked up for a song. Then he also realized that even though the gas at that time was worthless, you couldn't get paid for it, but you could get paid for gas liquids that you produce alongside the gas. He realized that you could sell those, whereas Gazprom ignored that potential. Mikhailson made a first fortune exporting gas liquids. He used that then to lay the foundations for the development of LNG in the Yamal Peninsula in partnership with the French. The guy's a genius, no question. And his company, Novatek, is leading the way. Full support from Putin, as I said. The governing constraint for Novatek, though, is transportation. Where do you get the tankers? And Mikhailson has turned, of course, to the one place where you go for tankers, and that's South Korea. But that, of course, puts him into conflict with Russia's import substitution program and also the very powerful shipbuilding interests in Russia itself, the dinosaur leftovers from the Russian shipbuilding ministry, which is a military ministry. So he's had to navigate that problem very carefully, ordering some of his tankers from Russian suppliers. He's teamed up with the Soviet Sovcomflot, basically on the QT, more or less, continuing to buy tankers from South Korea. You get the picture. In other words, the rate at which the LNG trade increases is going to be governed by the transportation constraint, the rate at which the Arctic Ocean melts, and then finally, as you said, the future of China as a buyer of Russian LNG. There, by the way, the Russians are competing with themselves. They have a gas pipeline project coming down into northeastern China, the Power of Siberia pipeline. And meanwhile, Mikhailson is already shipping LNG to southeast China, where the regasification facilities are. Where do the two flows of Russian gas meet? In Shanghai somewhere in a few years? That'll be an interesting scene.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, next three questions all have to do with Russian views of climate change in various ways. I think it'll be best to take them separately, but they're interconnected. But Joe Dresden, I'm sorry, Joe. Joe Dresden asks, can you talk about how Russia can pivot on ideology on climate? I recall a past senior Russian government advisor talking about climate change as an ideology of genocide against the Russian people.
I hadn't heard that one.
And
Okay.
also, I actually skipped a question, but let's take that one first.
All right. Well, of course, the answer is whose ideology? The Russian climate scientists have been on the case since the 1960s, and they have been issuing warnings that have become a little bit like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The voice of the climate scientists in Russia is Gidrometsluzhba, which publishes regular reports that are excellent science and, of course, are very strong warnings. So their ideology is save the planet, look at the danger. What you may be referring to is a movement that's become stronger and stronger in the outside world. I haven't heard too many echoes of it inside Russia, which is just, what do you call it? Just climate policy. That is to say, making sure that you do not discriminate against the poor as you develop your climate policies. That's become a very powerful movement in the West. But I'm not aware of having seen very much of that in the Russian media. By the way, one thing to note is, of course, we're talking about a thoroughly modern Russia here. Everybody's on the internet, everybody's online. Anybody who is interested in climate in Moscow has access to everything that is being discussed and projected and published in the West. So people are right, of course, on
right,
the
and
issue.
I think one of your projections is that might seep in even more. So it's so one of your scenarios, I should say, is that you could get heightened awareness, but after some time. The next one has to do with public opinions from Kelly Knight, who congratulates you on the book. Can you please comment about forest fires in Russia and the extent to which this has or may impact public opinion or other issues related to climate change?
Excellent question. And if you compare forest fires in East Siberia with forest fires in California, Oregon, Washington, and increasingly British Columbia, the differences really leap out. Because what makes the issue so urgent and dramatic in the American Northwest is that people live in those places. Whereas in Sakha, in East Siberia, where the fires are, there's so few people living there that it's even hard to track just how serious the problem is. Now, where fires then start to influence public opinion is when the smoke starts to roll into the cities, not just in Siberia, but starts to roll into the Urals and so on. And that apparently has been happening. That will get public opinion to respond in a hurry. Think of the reaction of Muscovites when every so often the peat bogs around Moscow catch fire and you get a pall of smoke over Moscow. You hear from Muscovites pretty quickly, although there's not much that can be done about it. In the case of East Siberia, there's also not much that can be done about the problem, but it does make Russians aware, at least until the rains come every fall.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the next one is also about public opinion from Mikhail Pierre Boudagyan. He says that you mentioned the public opinion and its lack of political capital to influence state officials. Given the considerably more green-oriented youth, even if the current regime does not, I think he means continue to exist in the upcoming decades, may we expect a more rapid shift towards energy transition due to public opinion, new generation of civil servants, So that's his question.
Well, as I suggest in the book, I think the major driver, and we're back to drivers as the building blocks for scenarios. I think the major driver in this case is going to be foreign markets. And so if we see a decisive move for real against oil, against gas, against coal over the next 30 years, why? I think that is going to be the main driver. Left on its own, Russia has very little incentive to change. As Putin says, hydrocarbons are our comparative advantage, domestically as well as externally. Okay, so the foreign market disappears. We still do very well on our own with gas-fired power, with internal combustion engines to drive our cars, gas to heat our homes. Where's the problem?
It's interesting because, you make the point that it's a very rational strategy in the short run, right? And it has been a rational strategy. But if you care about where you and the world will be in 2050, it's not so rational. So long-term versus short-term. Again, I have two questions about hydrogen, so I'm going to put together. Our colleague Anton Fedyashin of American University writes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I am currently finishing the bridge and I now have something to look forward to. Would you please explain the process of hydrogen extraction and how much energy the process itself demands? And what are hydrogen's industrial uses? Will Russia have an advantage only in supplying it because of its pipelines, or are there advantages in terms of sources of hydrogen also? And as an addendum, we have Jus Tavkar, who asks, are there other East European countries, for instance, in the Balkans, responding to Russians' plans of increased production and export of hydrogen?
Right. A very good overview of the potential for hydrogen as an answer to the green challenge appeared in The Economist maybe 3 months ago. And so for a primer on hydrogen, I strongly recommend that. And I give it to my students, and it's the headline from that briefing, as The Economist calls them, is that hydrogen has an important role to play. At the same time, it is not the answer. And there's some very fundamental reasons for that. The first is that hydrogen on its own is not a source of energy. You have to make it. And depending on how you make it, people give hydrogen different names of colors. So one of them is green hydrogen. Now that's hydrogen that's made from renewable power, solar and wind, and which therefore emits no carbon dioxide. That's the good hydrogen, that's the virtuous hydrogen. The problem for Russia is that they have no green hydrogen because they have not, up until now, built any renewables, and they are not likely, in my view, to move very far or very fast down that road. So green hydrogen is not what the Russians are talking about. Then there is blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen. What they have in common is that they're made with natural gas. Now, the problem with that is that that produces carbon dioxide in addition to hydrogen. So then the question is, what do you do with the carbon dioxide? Well, you can stuff it into the ground. That is so-called carbon capture and storage. And that is basically the Russian answer up until now. We're going to take our natural gas, of which we have lots, and we're going to split it. The carbon dioxide we will stuff into the ground. Now, the problem with that is that there are no technologies at present available that are proven to be economic on large scale. So we're talking about something that is still in the future. But then what do you do with the hydrogen at that point? You blend it with the gas, as Gazprom's thought. You put it in a pipeline, including the famous Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and you send it off to Europe. Now, more questions. Hydrogen by itself is highly corrosive. It eats through steel, or rather it destroys the structure of steel. A pipeline in which you have 100% hydrogen under present steel technology is not going to last very long, especially if it's at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. So again, we're talking about the deep future. So you see that hydrogen, the problem with hydrogen is technologies that are not yet ready. Insofar as we do have technologies that are ready, they are producing at a relatively low volume. And so what would you use the hydrogen for? You wouldn't use it on a massive scale to make electricity. What you would do with it is put it into hard to decarbonize sectors such as steel. And that's where the Economist says, at any rate, you're likely to see the earliest and most useful, most important applications. So is this the answer to the Russians' dilemmas? The future will tell, but the answer would appear to be no.
Thank you. So we are approaching the end of our time. I think we have time for two more questions. One is a second one from Mikhail Budagyan about the much beloved Chubais. Given his poor track record under Medvedev and Putin in terms of promoting innovative technologies, is a green innovative technology sector in Russia destined never to be born?
Well, it won't be for lack of Chubais trying. And there's marvelous YouTube footage of Chubais in his latest missionary guise, addressing the students of things like the Bauman Engineering University and so on. Very impressive, terrific speaker. You're ready to go out and build solar just from listening to him. You'll get religion in a hurry. But the problem is, first of all, capability. Insofar as solar has strong support in Moscow with the officialdom, it's because of its potential to create a photovoltaic industry, which would then provide high-tech exports from Russia to the rest of the world. Well, that's not on, because the Chinese went down that road 15, 20 years ago, and they destroyed the rest of the world's photovoltaic industry. There's no way that the Russians are going to be able to get off the ground with that. Chubais also had the problem that the conventional power people were very skeptical. What do we need solar for? Was basically their answer. And so Chubais found himself dependent on the goodwill of a handful of local governors and politicians who had a vision. In particular, the governor of Rostov turned out to be a great friend. But it was a very frustrating road. And Chubais may well be glad that he's been relieved of the account.
Well, thank you. And the last question is from me, and it returns to this thorny dilemma of how do you change the paradigm, right, that we've been skirting around in so many ways for the last hour. And I want to read you just two quotations from your own book, one from the introduction, one from the conclusion, because it has to do with the past, present, and future all together. On page 4, you write about all the changes that have been occurring, positive ones in the last decades, but then you write the changes that have occurred mostly conform, with a few exceptions, to a traditional Russian model, a preference for large companies that even when they are private are intertwined with the state in a web of interdependence. The state remains the dominant player, as it has throughout Russian history, and the pattern of policy remains top-down rather than bottom-up. The net effect is to strengthen Russia's traditional industrial model. So that's about the past and the present, and in the conclusion, you turn to the future, and you're talking about leapfrogging into a kind of, take advantage of high technology, which Russia really hasn't. And it brought back to me shades of Gershon's song, advantages of backwardness. You could potentially take advantage of the experiments and developments in other countries, but to do so, the greatest need, you write, is to empower this new generation by removing the obstacles that stand in the way of entrepreneurship and innovation, above all, loosening the grip of the all-powerful and corrupt bureaucracy and security apparatus. It is a familiar list. Reformers never tire of speaking it, but it requires overcoming the ingrained tendency of Russian officialdom to make the state great by making the people small and themselves wealthy. So here, I just wonder if you have any thoughts about, is what you called a tshuda, a miracle, at all possible by breaking, some unexpected breakout of this paradigm, or are we doomed, despite all the change, to kind of repeat ourselves?
Those are not fair questions, Michael. How do I know what I think until I hear what I wrote? Well, yeah, superb questions. And, if you have my back against the wall, I have to say that the Russia that I expect to see in 2050, if I'm still around to see it, would be a Russia with a very familiar structure of a strong state. That seems to be the Russian MO from time immemorial. At the same time, what about leapfrogging? For you as the historian, this must be, of course, a special challenge, because after all, Russia is a country that has leapfrogged first into the industrial era in a way that even before the Soviet revolution, leapfrogged again into the military industrial complex, leapfrogged again into space. The Russians have a history of leapfrogging. And of course, alongside that, they have a history of dreaming about leapfrogging. Never has a country been so reformed as Russia, at least in the minds of Russian reformers. And so we will surely not see an end to that story. But at the end of the day, I see the state.
If you could solve this problem, one thing I should say is that I hope your book is being translated into Russian. And if you don't have a translator, we can talk after this is over. But I just want to thank you so much. It was a really great conversation, and I want to thank the audience for coming. And do purchase this book. It's a wonderful education, and it's a great read as well.